Live.
Hi, I'm Shad, and this is my second video in teaching the principles of physiology. Today, what we're going to review is just a little bit about how our neurons kind of work with like action potentials and just capacitance and some of those things. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to start out with talking about what a resting membrane potential is. So up here, I'll do some drawings as I go along and teach. Up here on the board, let's draw a cell. This cell has a lot of things going on in it. But we've learned from our previous video that one of the things that's going on is we have this thing called the sodium potassium ATPase, which is a pump which moves sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell. So we're getting 3 sodiums coming out and 2 potassiums coming into the cell. And so when we have this going on, this is actually creating kind of like a separation of charge inside of our cell. Because if we have 3 sodiums leaving the cell and 2 potassiums coming into the cell, we kind of start getting the separation of charge, and we start getting a high concentration of potassium in the cell here. So it's really high on the inside, and we're going to have a lower concentration on the outside, just because of the way things are moving here. And so if we get a lot of potassium moving in, we're going to get that higher concentration inside, and we're also moving 3 charges out compared to 2. When we talk about the resting membrane potential of a cell, it's basically just, I'm going to draw up a graph over here on this side. The resting membrane potential is a specific voltage at which the cell membrane likes to rest at. And so this is just kind of like there's not really a lot of action going on in the cell. This is just where things are kind of normal. And so that resting membrane potential tends to be negative 70 millivolts on the cell membrane. And so that's the typical one. This can be lower or higher depending upon certain factors, but that's the typical resting membrane potential. And so that accounts for kind of the resting membrane potential. I'm just going to look and see what I'm going to go to next here, but yeah. So once we have that established, there's a couple equations I want to talk about right now. The first equation is what we call the Nernst equation. I'll write that right down here. Nernst equation is E is equal to negative 61.5 divided by Z times the concentration, the log of the concentration of a particular ion moving into the cell over it moving out. So I'm just going to make sure I got that right. So I'm teaching you guys right here. And yeah, that's what it is. So it's the concentration of N versus the concentration of that particle moving out. And so this Nernst equation, this Z down here, that is going to be representative of the charge of the ion that we're talking about when it's moving across the membrane. Because we know that the sodium-potassium pump isn't the only thing moving things into and out of the cell. There are multiple other factors that come into play here. So this is the charge of the ion that we're going to talk about, which is moving across the cell. So this is what we call the Nernst equation. It gives us something we call the Nernst potential. There's another equation I want to talk about, and this is called the driving force. So I'll just say driving force is dF here. And this equation here is going to be the voltage of the membrane minus our Nernst potential that we just talked about earlier. So driving force is kind of like, it will tell us like how much and how quickly like an ion can get across the membrane almost. So those two equations are going to help us to understand kind of the behaviors of some of the things that happen. Like I said earlier, we're going to get a high concentration of potassium in the cell while we have a lower concentration on the outside. We learned about in the previous video about leak channels. And potassium has leak channels that are along the membrane. So potassium is going to want to move out of the cell here. And there's going to be a lot of other things that happen as well. And so here in our drawing, if our resting membrane potential is at negative 70 millivolts, I'm going to create another couple of points here. This is going to start to begin to change. And it kind of changes like slowly and slowly and slowly. And it's going to reach up to a certain point. And we're just going to call that point right here negative 55 millivolts. Or this is what we call the threshold. So this is our threshold here. I'll write it over next to this side. Let me just kind of get back on track here. Like I said, there's a lot of things moving in and out of the cell, and at this point, the only thing that we're really concerned about is our leak channels from potassium. So we have these potassium leak channels here. Another thing that we're going to start considering here in a minute is sodium voltage gated channels on the cell. So let me draw that up really quick. Our sodium voltage gated channels work to move sodium from the outside of the cell into the cell. And so our sodium voltage gated channels might look something like this, where we have this little door on the bottom. We also have something we call a ball and chain right there. So those are the two components of the sodium voltage gated channels. Now, when our membrane reaches threshold limit, since this is a sodium voltage gated channel, there's a certain voltage that's going to open up that door that blocks sodium from coming in. When that door is closed, no sodium can come in. But once a certain voltage on the membrane is reached, we'll say negative 55 millivolts here, this door swings open. So this door is going to swing open here, and sodium now starts entering the cell. Now, sodium enters the cell, it has a positive charge. And so now this is going to shoot up. And it's going to keep shooting up until it reaches kind of a max limit of it going into the cell. So here at threshold, we can say that our sodium voltage gated channels are open. While beforehand, over here, that resting membrane potential, they were closed. Now this act of going from negative 70 millivolts to a more positive value, we're going to call this depolarization. And so I'll write that word up here, depolarization. As we move from our negative to a more positive value, this was already polar. We kind of had an established charge. But as we start to counteract the charge that was established, that's what we call depolarization. So we start to depolarize greatly over here, and it reaches its little limit. And once it reaches that limit, there's something we call the inactivation part of the sodium voltage gated channel. So we reach this limit up here, and our door is going to stay open because this threshold right here is what opens the door. We're still above that threshold, so the door stays open with the charge. But we have this part of the ball and chain part, which is our inactivation part, is going to kind of plug up that hole so sodium stops coming into the cell. So we get to the point where we have enough sodium in the cell here, right? It's flooded in. It's made the voltage increase. Now we're going to close this up and plug this hole up. We're just kind of plugging it up. We're inactivating it. We're not completely closing it. It's just an inactive form where it's going to stop allowing the sodium to rush in like it was before. At this point up here, another thing occurs. So on the cell membrane, we have another thing called potassium gated channels as well. And once the cell reaches a certain threshold, a certain charge, these things open as well. And so because we went to the charge that opens this potassium voltage gated channel, potassium starts to flow into the cell at high rates. We still have this potassium, sodium potassium ATPase working to bring potassium into the cell. We're also going to have this potassium voltage gated channel bringing potassium into the cell. And it's going to flush in, it's going to run in really quick. It's going to cause this to, my bad, I drew that the wrong way. Sorry, forgive me. The potassium is going to flood out of the cell because we still have that high concentration of potassium into the cell. It floods out of the cell, and as we lose positive charges rapidly, we're going back down towards a negative charge. So our cell's membrane is going to rapidly decrease towards a negative charge. We call this hyperpolarization, or this because it's going to drop below the membrane potential a little bit because it came in so quickly. And then once it kind of realizes it's overshot its limit there, we're going to reestablish a resting membrane potential right there. And so what's happening here is we have our potassium voltage gated channels, which were once closed, are going to open here. Potassium rushes out of the cell. We become more negative. At this point here, like I said before, this was inactivated, but once we pass that voltage limit, it's going to close our sodium voltage gated channels here. They're going to be fully closed because that voltage of negative 55 millivolts is not there anymore once we go below it. And down here, once we've reached kind of an overshot with the potassium flooding out of the cell, we're going to close up that potassium voltage gated channel. And there's going to be a lot of these, so maybe like a couple are still open because it overshot, but once we get to here, they're all closed. They're all going to be closed, and we still have those leak channels working for potassium. So we reestablish resting membrane potential, and that's kind of what's happening. One other ion I want to talk about is calcium. And calcium is going to help establish our threshold here. So calcium is responsible for helping to establish the threshold. Another component of our voltage-gated sodium channel is we have this thing called, we're just going to call it the springy thingy for now. It's a spring. It's technically called the S4 subunit, but we're going to call it the springy thingy. And potassium sits in here on that. It sits in the spring. So potassium.
Calcium.
Oh, my bad. Yeah, calcium. I'm mixing up my words. This is calcium. Calcium sits in the spring, and that is what's going to influence the threshold limit. So like different concentrations of calcium will influence if this is a higher or lower threshold. A couple other words I want to talk about. Did you have a question, Spencer?
I was wondering about refractories. What refractory is?
Yeah, great question. So let's talk about that really quick. We have something called the absolute refractory period, and we have something that we call the relative refractory period. So in our absolute refractory period, this is represented by that brown line there. Refractory period. Here, this is where I failed to mention this word before, possibly, but the word action potential. This is basically where the word action potential means our sodium voltage gauge channels are open, and this creates the depolarization further of the cell. So in the absolute refractory period, this is where we get our action potential occurring. It's above the threshold limit. That's our absolute refractory period. Our relative refractory period was represented by this blue line I showed here. And that's basically just going to be the point where we dip back down and then reestablish resting membrane potential. And that's what we call our relative refractory period. Let me think here. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything else as I'm talking about this. There's technically the words rising phase and falling phase. So rising phase is where we begin to depolarize, go up, and then the falling phase is where we start to reestablish resting membrane potential, fall back down. And so that rising phase helps us to create an action potential, and then the falling phase helps us to go back to resting membrane potential. Let me think. Any other questions for me?
What is the action potential the same as a graded potential?
Oh, that's a very great question. So we have something called a graded potential and then the action potential. Our graded potential is just going to be this area in red right here, just going from our resting membrane potential up to our threshold limit. And that graded potential is just caused by a bunch of different ions that are influencing the charge of the cell's membrane. So we're going to have a bunch of ions going back and forth and floating in and floating out. And that helps us to set up a threshold limit, like it's everything before the threshold limit. The action potential is everything that goes after the threshold up here. So our action potential is the rise past the threshold limit. Our graded potential is the rise before the threshold limit. All right, let's keep going here. I think I'm going to move on to the last part of this video and wrap it up. So I'm going to erase the board here. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about the words capacitance and length constant. So imagine we have a neuron right here. This is what we call the axon of the neuron. Like I was saying before, we have charges across the membrane typically. So let's say there's some positive charges out here and some negative charges on the inside. Let's try to make it kind of even here. It doesn't really matter, but Yeah, there we go. Okay, cool. So we have this word called capacitance. I'm really bad at spelling. How do you? Capacitance. Oh, I spelled that just a little. Capacitance. There we go. So we have an equation for it that C is equal to, oh, my brain is slipping. I'm just going to make sure I get this right here. I don't want to teach anything wrong. Oh, it's Q divided by V. So C is equal to Q divided by V. Basically, what capacitance is telling us is like how many charges are sitting across the membrane. So this Q number right here, this is going to be our number of charges across the membrane. And then V is going to be the voltage, or not the voltage, sorry, the volts of the membrane. That's important. It's the volts of the membrane, not the voltage. And so if you think about this here, we can think of how many charged particles are sitting across the membrane and then the volt of that membrane. So if we have a ton of charged particles across the membrane, to create that volt, that means we're going to have a high capacitance. But if we don't have a ton of charged particles and we still have that same volts of the membrane, that's going to create So if we have a ton here, and let's say we had like 100 charges and our volts of the membrane was like 70 still, then that would create a higher capacitance than something like 10 charged particles with the same charge of 70, which would be a lower capacitance. And so it really just depends on how many charged particles are across the membrane. That's our capacitance. Now let's talk about our length constant. That's another term we want to go over. So let's say we have the sodium voltage gated channel here. It's open. We get a charge coming through sodium, right? It's going to create the signal. The signal is going to go through the cell, and it's going to reach another sodium voltage gated channel, and that signal it's going to trigger the opening of this one. So this one opens first, and then it's going to trigger the opening of another one. There's kind of a chain reaction all the way down the axon. So length constant, what that has to do with this is, let's draw it up. This lambda, which is a Greek symbol, is equal to our length constant. So we're going to say lambda is equal to the square root of Rm divided by Ri. Rm is the resistance of the membrane, and Ri is internal resistance. So our length constant is going to tell us how far this signal can actually travel to activate another sodium gated channel, voltage gated channel. So if we have a high resistance of the membrane, which means if we have a higher resistance of the membrane, then that means our length constant is higher. Resistance of the membrane is basically how well the membrane allows other particles to come into it. The internal resistance is basically the description of how many things are inside the membrane that will block the signal from traveling. For example, there can be charged particles in here, there can be different proteins, just things that get into the membrane, and these things act as like barriers to the signal. Like imagine like a bunch of walls. your voice can only travel so far. If there's a wall in front of it, it can kind of cancel out your sound. So the people on the other side of the wall aren't going to hear what you're saying, but the people on your side of the wall will. This is kind of like a bunch of walls kind of blocking the signal from activating the next sodium gated channel, voltage gated channel. So that's internal resistance and resistance of the membrane. Those directly relate to length constant. But there's one more thing I'd like to talk about, how capacitance and length constant relate to something else. And we call this myelin, a myelin sheath. So sometimes on our neurons, we have myelin sheaths. Myelin sheaths actually are going to help us to increase our length constant in the cell and decrease the capacitance. That's what myelin does. So myelin basically separates the number of charges on the membrane. It makes it so there's less charges on the membrane. So that means it's harder for things to get into the membrane. Our resistance to the membrane is going to go up, thus making our length constant go up. And so myelin basically acts as a buffer area for our length constant to increase and our capacitance to decrease. So that a signal coming from a sodium can travel further to reach another sodium gated channel, voltage gated channel, to open that one. So like they don't have to be so close together, they can be further apart. And I think that's all I have for this video. Are there any final questions for me?
No.
All right, thank you so much, guys. See ya.